One of my favorite fictional detectives is Lieutenant Frank Columbo, who appeared in the Columbo episodes of the NBC mystery movie between 1971 and 1978. I gotta admit, though, the guy was kinda sneaky, always acting like a bumbling, goofy amateur in a rumpled raincoat right up until the moment he confronted the suspect with a detailed account of how he'd caught him. Pretty sneaky. So it's kinda on the nose that Greg Koukl would pick this particular detective as an icon for one of his favorite tactics. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. Last time, Greg went over some reservations that Christians might have when it comes to witnessing, and sad to say, he gave his readers some pretty compelling reasons to keep on witnessing no matter how often they fail. And more's the pity for the rest of us. But he did have some good points mixed in with the bad, and we're going to see the same mix in Chapter 3 as well. And the topic of Chapter 3 is what he calls the Columbo Tactic. He starts off by giving 4 examples of situations where believers might suddenly find themselves in the presence of folks who says things that's incompatible with the believer's preferred flavor of Christianity. Now, obviously, that's triggering to a lot of modern evangelicals, but what should they say in that situation? How should they respond? Well, Greg's answer is what he calls the Columbo Tactic, and that's what I want to talk about now. We'll skip over his examples and come back to them later, but meanwhile, let's look at how it's all supposed to work. Quote, "The key to the Columbo Tactic is to go on the offensive in an inoffensive way, with carefully selected questions that advance the conversation. Never make a statement, at least at first, when a question will do the job." End quote. Now, of course, if God was real, you wouldn't need to frame your social interactions in terms of a sneaky detective going on the offensive against a dangerous criminal. You'd be able to straightforwardly state your own beliefs, and you'd have ample, objective, verifiable evidence to justify them, because the God who wants all men to be saved would have provided it. But since believers ain't got all that, they has to indulge in a bit of subterfuge. They's been offended to find other folks who don't believe the same religion as they do, so they's going to respond by going on the offensive. But they's going to be sneaky about it. Or at least they think they's being sneaky. Thing is, folks know when you's asking leading questions, and they can see the implications behind the way you phrase things. The "I'm just asking questions" gambit is right up there with "I was only joking" as a transparent attempt to avoid accountability for the agenda you's obviously pursuing. But that don't mean it ain't a popular gambit among certain folks, as Greg himself demonstrates. Quote, "Once I got into a spirited conversation with the actor's wife about animal rights. I had serious reservations about her ideas, but I didn't contradict her directly. Instead, I asked questions meant to expose some of the weaknesses I saw in her view. Eventually, she began to challenge what she thought were my beliefs. I pointed out that I'd never stated my beliefs. I'd only been asking questions. I was off the hook." End quote. Yeah, no. Anybody who's had to deal with internet trolls knows that trolls love the "I was only asking questions" stuff. Greg thinks he's successfully avoided accountability for the views he is advocating, but he hasn't, and the woman he was talking to very clearly spotted it. He's just being disingenuous and encouraging other believers to follow his example. And just by way of contrast, my approach would have been to say what I believed and why I believed it. And you can do that without directly contradicting the other person. All you got to do is say, "Well, that's interesting, but I tend to think such and such because so-and-so." You don't have to say, "Oh, no, that's wrong, you're wrong." You can just say, "Oh, well, that's not how I see it." And maybe the other person will still disagree, but they'll have a lot more respect for your honesty if you just state your mind and don't go in for all the sneaky, disingenuous stuff. Having said that, though, I do agree with Greg that a lot of the time it's better to ask a question and listen to the answer, at least apart from all the tactical stuff. Like Greg says, quote, "Sincere questions are friendly and flattering. They invite genial interactions by focusing on something the other person cares a lot about, herself and her ideas." End quote. And that's exactly right. If you want to have an interesting conversation with somebody, ask them about themselves. Someone gave me that advice when I was a socially awkward teenager, and it really works. The catch is that they has to be sincere questions asked out of genuine interest. And that ain't the Columbo tactic. The Columbo tactic says you should use questions to take control of a conversation and steer it toward a predetermined goal. And that's the opposite of having a sincere, genuine interest in the other person and what they has to say about themselves. Kudos to Greg, though, for avoiding the archaic and patriarchal practice of always using masculine pronouns to refer to people in general. That's encouraging to see, especially in a book by a conservative Christian. Goes to show that even evangelists can see the advantages of being at least a little bit, quote-unquote, woke. Greg's second point about the advantages of asking questions is the best of the three. Quote, second, you'll get an education. You'll leave the conversation knowing more than when you arrived. End quote. And this is also very true, with the caveat that education requires being open to learning. If in your attitude is that you already knows all the right answers, that's going to impede your ability to learn better ones. Greg goes on to add that sometimes you can use what you learn to quote-unquote make a difference, which sounds to me like a case of he's got all the right answers and is just looking for ways to contradict what the other person is saying, and that's a huge impediment to genuine learning. His third point about the advantages of asking questions is the worst of the three, unfortunately. Quote, third, questions allow you to make progress on a point without being pushy. Since questions are largely neutral, or at least seem that way, they don't sound preachy. When you ask a question, you aren't stating your view, so you have nothing to defend. End quote. And here Greg's just fooling himself. The kinds of questions he's talking about is called leading questions, and they has a deservedly bad reputation. They has an unavoidable element of aggression and judgmentalism, and contrary to Greg's reassurance, they do sound preachy and opinionated. Trolls uses all these kinds of questions all the time to deliberately irritate folks and provoke emotional reactions, and that's a big part of the reason why Trolls is so annoying. Greg may be able to convince himself he's pulling a fast one, but he ain't fooling the rest of us. And what about that last bit there about having nothing to defend? Greg may be saying the quiet part out loud here. Apologists is supposed to be proud to defend the gospel, but the whole point of the Columbo tactic is to avoid having to defend anything. Kind of sounds like maybe Greg has had some bad experiences while attempting to defend his views. But anyways, that's it. That's basically the whole Columbo tactic. Ask folks innocent-sounding questions. That's really just a sneaky trick to take over the conversation and drive it towards your predetermined conclusion, all the while fooling yourself into thinking that the other person's too dumb to catch on to what she's really doing. In a way, I'm sort of glad that Greg's proposing such a misguided and self-defeating tactic, but Lordy Lord, it's tedious for the rest of us to have to put up with it. Anyways, let's go back and look at some of his examples, because that's where I think the interesting stuff is. His first example is about a bunch of Christians getting together at the home of a church member and having a nice little chat about quote-unquote spiritual things when the host's 15-year-old son blurts out that he don't believe in God no more and it ain't rational and there ain't no proof. So in this hypothetical example, Greg would whip out his Columbo tactic by asking some supposedly innocuous questions. Quote, what do you mean by God? That is, what kind of God do you reject? What specifically is irrational about believing in God? Since you're concerned about proof for God's existence, what kind of evidence would you consider acceptable? What arguments for God have you considered and what did you find wrong with them? End quote. These are some pretty common apologetics questions, and I think it's a good idea for us to spend some time thinking about how best to answer them, so let's take a few minutes to do just that. The first question is, what do you mean by God? And it's an attempt to discredit the unbeliever by suggesting that they has the wrong God in mind. A favorite line used by apologists like Bill Craig is to say, well, I don't believe in that God either, and then go on to describe God in some way that's sufficiently different to make the skeptic look ignorant. So let's see how a skeptic could avoid that trap when talking to an apologist. Skeptic: I don't believe in God. Apologist: what do you mean by God? Skeptic: see, that's the thing. There's not even a common, objective definition for what the concept of God refers to. It only exists in folks' heads. If I expressed an opinion about Donald Trump being a good or a bad president, you wouldn't ask me, what do you mean by Donald Trump? Because he's objectively real. Folks may have good or bad opinions about him, but everybody knows who he is. So now we've not only avoided the trap, we've turned it around. The fact that he even has to ask what God means is itself evidence it's more consistent with God being a mythical character who only exists in folks' imaginations. And notice, we ain't asking any leading questions or sneaking any gotchas into the conversation. All we've done is to point out things that's well known to everybody. And by not asking any questions, we've deprived the apologist of the opportunity to make a snappy answer. Well, they can still try and answer, but we just made their job a lot harder. Next question, what specifically is irrational about believing in God? And this one's trickier because it ain't a well-formed question. There's specific things about the Christian God that's irrational, like the doctrine of the Trinity, for example, but to claim that the concept of God as a whole is irrational, that's overly broad. The best way to answer this question is to avoid it by being specific in the first place. For example, God is commonly portrayed as an immaterial being who does things that's essentially magic. Modern believers prefer terms like miracle and supernatural, but when it comes right down to what those words really mean, it's essentially just the same as magic. And magic is irrational. There ain't no logical reason why saying the words, "let there be light," would magically create the very first photons, for example, or why saying, "peace be still," would make a storm die down. It's all just magic, and it only happens in stories people tell, even if they claim the stories really happened in the real world. But there's always some reason why God can't do the same magic right now in the real world for the rest of us to see. Logically, we ought to take that as evidence that the story simply ain't true, since that's the simplest explanation that's consistent with our real-world observations. But believers reject real-world observations in favor of stories about magical stuff happening. And that's irrational. Next question. What kind of evidence would you consider acceptable as evidence for God? This is an easy one. If God was real, I'd expect to see real-world observations that was consistent with God being real as a natural consequence of his real existence. For example, God's supposed to be perfect, and perfect means they ain't nothing he lacks, and he couldn't possibly be any better. And that means he wouldn't create nothing because his creation couldn't supply him with nothing he don't already have. There's nothing creation could do to make him a better God or to give him something he lacks. And for comparison, if God's a myth that folks use to advance their own personal interests, I'd expect the story to be about a God who was maximally perfect so that believers could impress other folks with how great their God was. The so-called created universe would still have to exist since the story's being told by folks living in the universe, but they'd imagine him as a perfect God, even though a perfect God wouldn't have created the universe. And of course, the apologist will object that I'm setting the bar absurdly high just to give myself an excuse for not believing, but I ain't. A God who don't create nothing outside of himself is logically consistent with, and logically follows from, the attributes of perfection that's ascribed to God. I ain't arbitrarily moving the goalposts nowhere. That's where they naturally fall, given the initial premises. But okay, let's say God has some slight trivial imperfection that makes it so he needs a creation that he can love and that loves him back. And let's say that he specifically wants to be loved by creatures that's created in his own image. What's the logical, most reasonable consequences we'd expect to arise given those premises? Well, God supposedly is a timeless, spaceless, immaterial being who's perfectly holy, righteous, and incorruptible, so we'd naturally expect creatures made in his image to be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and incorruptibly holy and righteous. In fact, we'd expect all of creation to be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and incorruptible, since it's the work of a perfect creator, and since all them qualities is the qualities of perfection as manifested in the creator itself. And on the other hand, if God's a myth, we'd expect to find folks being just ordinary folks with ordinary flaws who simply claim to be made in God's image somehow. Again, I ain't setting any bars arbitrarily high or low. This is just the consequences that would most reasonably and naturally follow, given the truth of the original premises. I could go on, but I think you get the idea. The consequences that would naturally ensue from God really existing is so radically different from the reality we see all around us, and so consistent with the consequences that would result of God being a myth, that it would be foolish to come to any other conclusion than the one that says God must be a myth. And again, notice I ain't asking any leading questions here. I was just drawing attention to the things that any rational person should find plausible and reasonable. Fourth question. What arguments for God have you considered and what did you find wrong with them? AKA the time waster's veto. We're supposed to exhaustively go through every possible argument for God's existence, including ones we've never heard of, and including ones that nobody's even thought of yet. Supposedly, we can't claim that God ain't real until we've wasted our entire lives on an endless task. My answer to that one is this. If and there was one good argument that conclusively demonstrated God's existence, believers would use that argument instead of using all the bad ones. And conversely, if there ain't no good argument in favor of God, then we'd expect to see believers using a bunch of bad arguments despite those arguments being factually wrong and or logically fallacious. In other words, believers using bad arguments for God is evidence that they don't know no good ones. Otherwise, they'd use the better argument. We don't need to look at each and every possible argument for God. We just need to look at the arguments that believers is actually using. Take the Kalam cosmological argument, for example. The Kalam cosmological argument assumes that nothing existed prior to the Big Bang, and therefore some immaterial creative force must exist outside of space and time in order to create the initial singularity. And that's a false assumption. The word before refers to a point in time earlier than some other point in time, and time has to exist in order for there to be any points in it. It's logically impossible for there to be any point in time where nothing exists because time itself is something. And if something exists, then it's false to say that nothing exists. So there's never been a time when nothing existed. And since time is merely one coordinate of space-time, that means there's never been a time when space-time did not exist. And also, by the way, the law of conservation of energy tells us that the total energy of the universe is constant across time, which means there's never been a time when matter and energy did not already exist. And that's the material universe, matter and energy in space and time, existing for all of time. There was never a time when the material universe did not already exist. So if and there was never a time when the material universe did not already exist, then there was never a time when any creative force could have created it out of nothing. Which means the Kalam cosmological argument is flat out wrong since it's based on the false assumption that nothing existed before the Big Bang. Or let's take the moral argument. The moral argument relies on cherry-picking the data by saying that everybody has the same moral standards except where they don't. In Nazi-controlled Europe, there was two clearly conflicting moral standards about whether it was wrong to lie to Nazi authorities about where the Jews was hiding. And even today, Christians still disagree about which of those moral standards was correct. Plus, the moral argument fails Occam's razor by failing to acknowledge the fact that moral standards arise naturally as folks in the society tries to learn the best way to get along with one another. And it fails to explain or even acknowledge the fact that moral standards evolve and improve over time, which is why we don't condone slavery and polygamy no more. All in all, the moral argument not only fails to prove God's existence, it's actually arguing against God being the true moral lawgiver, since biblical moral standards allowed for things like genocide and sex trafficking. And yet, Christians still present it as if it was a good argument for God's existence. I could go on, but that's just a couple of the more popular apologetic arguments for God, and these bad arguments, just like all the rest. Believers would use better arguments if they had them, but they don't. Plus, there's the fact that arguments is a tool for persuading folks, and if you's good at arguing, you can persuade folks to believe stuff that ain't true. The fact that God's existence depends on arguments instead of objectively verifiable evidence is itself evidence that's consistent with God being a myth that apologists just talks folks into believing. So that's it for the first example, and Greg has 3 more, but I think even one more would make this video overly long, so I'm going to stop here and save the last 3 for next week. The countertactics for Greg's Columbo is to take the good and leave the bad. Ask questions that come from a genuine and sincere interest to learn about the other person, and don't ask the questions designed to drive a person to a particular conclusion. Don't even do it to convince the other person that God's a myth. Just state your own beliefs and give reasons for them without confronting or challenging what the other person says. It's enough of a challenge just for them to see that you don't believe. And of course, deconstruct your own beliefs. Know why you believe what you believe and have clear, solid reasons for them so you'll be ready when Greg puts on his rumpled raincoat and says, "Oh, just one more thing, Columbo style." And if you don't feel like you've got good reasons for why you don't believe, well, keep watching. That's what I'm here for. And there's lots of other good atheist YouTubers out there like Vice and Genetically Modified Skeptic and lots more that folks can recommend in the comments if they'd like to. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time we'll pick up where we left off and have a look at Greg's last 3 examples. They's going to be similar to his first one, but there's enough unique and interesting stuff in there to make a video out of, so it should be a good time. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.